The journey has been long and difficult, but the final resolution is finally within your reach today. Stay with us as we piece together the last bit of the puzzle and reveal the final truth. Click subscribe now and witness the most important ending of our cinematic arc.
Before I tell you what happened at my son-in-law's company dinner, I need you to understand one thing. By the time I drove home that night, hands steady on the wheel, I already knew exactly what I was going to do. I wasn't angry anymore. Angry men make mistakes. I was something quieter than that. Something that takes 37 years of building things with your hands to become. My name is Walter Greer. I'm 64 years old. I spent my career as a licensed master plumber in Nashville, Tennessee. I built my own small contracting business from nothing. 2 trucks, a good reputation, and a rule I never broke. Every pipe I touched, every joint I sealed, every inspection I signed off on, had to be right. Not almost right. Not good enough to pass. Right. Because in my trade, the difference between those two things is the difference between a family sleeping safely in their home and a family that doesn't wake up. I retired 3 years ago. My daughter, Claire, got married 2 years before that. His name is Brandon Whitfield. He runs a residential development company here in Nashville, Whitfield Homes, and he has the kind of confidence that fills a room before he even opens his mouth. I noticed that about him the first time Claire brought him home. I didn't say anything. Claire was 31. She was happy, and it wasn't my place. I shook his hand, asked him about his work, listened carefully. He talked for 40 minutes about himself. I don't think he asked me a single question. The dinner was a quarterly event Brandon hosted for his investors and contractors. Claire called it a business social. About 60 people in a private room at a restaurant downtown, the kind of place with no prices on the menu. I wore the nicest jacket I owned. Claire looked beautiful. She squeezed my arm when we walked in and said, "Dad, just try to have a good time. That's the thing about warnings. Sometimes they come from the people who love you most." Brandon moved through the room like a man who had rehearsed it. Handshakes, laughs, a hand on the shoulder here, a leaned-in whisper there. I stood near the bar with a glass of water and watched. Claire introduced me to a few people, a contractor named Miles, a woman named Patricia who handled Brandon's marketing. Everyone was pleasant. I was having a fine enough time. Then Brandon found me. He came over with 2 men I hadn't met, one in his 40s with a thick watch, one younger, maybe 30, holding a bourbon. Brandon put his arm around my shoulder the way you do with someone you're about to make a prop. "Gentlemen," he said, "this is Walter, Claire's dad. Retired now, but back in the day." He paused, and I could feel the smile in his voice before I saw it. He was a plumber. The 2 men nodded politely. I nodded back. 37 years, I said. Walter was very good at his job, Brandon said. And the way he said it slowly, pleasantly, like he was describing a loyal old dog, made the man with the bourbon look down at his glass for just a moment. That small flicker told me he heard it too. We actually had the city's top plumbing inspector out to look at one of our new builds last month. "Isn't that right, Walter? You used to know those guys?" I said I did. "Of course you did." He gave my shoulder a single pat and turned back to his investors. "Anyway, let me tell you about Elmwood Terrace. 32 units, starting in the low 400s. He walked away. I stood there with my water glass. The man with the bourbon glanced at me once more before following. I smiled at him. He looked away quickly. I found Claire across the room. She was talking to Patricia and laughing at something, and I didn't want to interrupt her. I found a quiet corner instead and stood there for a while, thinking about what had just happened and deciding how I felt about it. Here is what I felt. I felt the specific, quiet humiliation of a man who has spent his entire life doing something real, something that matters, being reduced to a punchline in a room full of people who have never once picked up a pipe wrench. I felt it the way you feel a cold draft through a wall. Not dramatically, not in a way that makes you shout, but in a way that makes you go find where the gap is. I ate dinner. I was polite to everyone around me. I asked the man on my left about his work. He was a real estate attorney. Perfectly nice. And I listened to his answers. Brandon gave a short speech about Whitfield Homes' expansion into a second Nashville suburb. People clapped. Claire caught my eye from across the table and smiled. I smiled back. On the drive home, I thought about Elmwood Terrace. I had heard the name before. One of my former apprentices, a young man named Danny Kowalski, had called me about 6 months earlier. Danny was freelancing at the time, picking up subcontracting work where he could find it. He'd been brought in for rough-in plumbing on a new residential development, a 30-unit build in the Donelson area. He called me because something was bothering him. "Walt," he said, "I'm looking at the plans they handed me, and I don't think these drain slopes are right. And the clean-out placements, I've never seen it done this way." I asked him who the GC was. He told me it was Whitfield Homes. I had told him to document everything, photograph anything that looked off, and if they pushed back on corrections, to walk away from the job. Danny was a good plumber. He didn't need the aggravation of a GC who cut corners. He texted me 2 weeks later. They'd let him go after he raised concerns about the pipe specifications. They'd brought in a different crew. I had filed that conversation away. I had not thought about it again until I was driving home from that dinner, hands steady on the wheel, Brandon's voice still pleasant in my memory. The next morning I called Danny. He answered on the second ring. I told him I needed to ask him some questions about the Whitfield job, and that I needed him to be specific. He talked for almost an hour. He told me about the pipe grade deviations. He told me about the material substitutions, places where the specs called for one thing and what was actually in the wall was something cheaper, something that would work fine for 5 years and start failing in 10. He told me about a conversation he'd overheard between a site supervisor and a man he didn't recognize, something about making the numbers work on the rough-in. He had photographs, 41 of them, still on his phone. I asked him to send them to me. Then I spent 4 days being methodical. I am not a detective. I am not a lawyer. I am a 64-year-old retired plumber who spent nearly 4 decades learning one trade well enough to teach it to other people. But that trade comes with knowledge. It comes with 37 years of reading blueprints, understanding building codes, recognizing the difference between a variance and a violation, and knowing exactly which violations create danger for the people who will eventually live inside those walls. I pulled the permit records for Elmwood Terrace from the Metro Nashville permit portal. They are public documents. Any citizen can access them. I pulled the approved plumbing plans. I compared them, line by line, to the photographs Danny had sent me. I found 14 discrepancies, not cosmetic issues, not technicalities. 14 instances where what was permitted, inspected, and approved on paper was different from what appeared to be actually installed. Drain slope violations, incorrect venting configurations. In 2 locations, what looked like flexible corrugated pipe used in places that required rigid, a substitution that is cheaper, faster, and banned by code in Tennessee for concealed residential installation because of how it fails. I wrote everything down. I organized it clearly. I included the relevant code sections, the permit numbers, the photograph references. I was not writing an accusation. I was writing a report the same way I had written reports for 37 years. On the 5th day, I called a man named Gerald Oates. Gerald had been the city's chief plumbing inspector for 19 years. We had worked together countless times. He was thorough, fair, and he cared about the work the way people who last in that job always do. He retired 2 years before I did. We had lunch occasionally and talked about our grandchildren. I told him I needed someone to look at what I had put together and tell me whether I was reading it correctly or whether I was an old man finding problems that weren't there. He drove to my house the next afternoon. He sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and went through every page, every photograph, every code citation. He didn't say much while he read. He asked me twice to clarify a reference. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at me over his reading glasses. "Walter," he said, "you're not finding problems that aren't there." I asked him what he thought the right thing to do was. He said he thought I already knew the answer to that. I submitted the complaint to the Metro Nashville Department of Codes and Building Safety 11 days after Brandon's dinner. I included the full documentation. I included Danny's photographs. I included Gerald's written assessment of the code violations. He offered it without me asking. Said he'd rather put his name on it now than read about a sewer backup flooding someone's basement in 3 years. I did not call Claire beforehand. I thought about it for a long time. I decided that what I had found was not about Brandon humiliating me at a dinner party. It was about 32 families who were about to buy homes. Some of them would have children. Some of them would be old, like me. None of them would know what was behind their walls. That was the reason I filed the complaint. And I needed to be honest with myself that it was the only reason. The investigation took 6 weeks. During that time, I had dinner with Claire twice. I brought her flowers once. We talked about her work, she's a physical therapist, and about her garden, which was doing well that spring. We talked about everything except Brandon's company. She seemed happy. I was glad of that. Brandon called me once, about 3 weeks after I filed. He was cordial. He said he was reaching out to family because there had been a regulatory matter with one of his projects, and he wanted everyone to know it was routine, that these things happened in construction, that it would be resolved quickly. He used the word routine 3 times. I told him I hoped everything worked out and that I would see him soon. He said he appreciated my support. I didn't tell him what I had done. I didn't need to. The department issued its findings on a Thursday. I read them online that evening at my kitchen table, the same table where Gerald and I had sat with the photographs spread between us. The report confirmed 11 of my 14 flagged items as code violations. 2 of the remaining 3 were noted as requiring further review. 1 was dismissed. They ordered Whitfield Homes to halt sales activity on Elmwood Terrace pending remediation. They required destructive inspection of the walls in question, meaning the drywall had to come out in multiple units so inspectors could physically verify what was behind it. They issued a formal notice of violation and referred the matter to the State Contractor Licensing Board for review of whether the violations were the result of negligent supervision or something more deliberate. The halt order went public the following Monday. By Wednesday, 2 of Brandon's investors had made statements through attorneys. The local news had a brief story. A real estate attorney, not the pleasant one from the dinner. Someone else had sent letters to the 12 buyers who had already signed purchase agreements for units in Elmwood Terrace. The sales pipeline stopped. The construction loan came under scrutiny. By the end of that month, Whitfield Homes had missed a payment to their primary lender. I learned most of this from Danny, who heard it from people still working in the trades around Nashville. I didn't look for the information. It found me the way things do in a city where people talk. Claire called me on a Sunday morning. She asked if she could come over. She sat across from me at that same kitchen table. She looked tired, in the way that people look tired, when they have been doing the math on something for days and keep arriving at the same answer. She asked me directly, had I filed the complaint? I told her yes. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something in the yard. Then she said, "Was it real? What you found?" I told her it was. I told her about Danny's call 6 months earlier. I told her about the photographs and the permit records and Gerald's assessment. I told her about the 2 families whose units had the flexible pipe violations, the ones that fail slowly and invisibly, the ones where the damage shows up in a child's bedroom wall years after everyone has forgotten what's behind it. She looked at her hands. She said, "I need some time." I told her I understood. I told her I was sorry for the pain this caused her. And I meant it completely. I told her that was separate from whether what I had done was right, and that I believed it was right, and that I would make the same decision again. She nodded. She didn't hug me when she left. I stood at the window and watched her car back out of the driveway, and I let myself feel how much that cost. She called me 3 weeks later. She said she had talked to a lawyer of her own. She said she had talked to the buyer's attorney. She said she understood now why I had done it, and she wanted to have dinner. We had dinner that Friday. She cried a little. I held her hand across the table. We didn't talk about Brandon much. We talked about her garden and my grandchildren, her sister's kids, 2 boys who call me Pop and still think plumbing is the most interesting job in the world. The last thing she said before she left that night was, "Dad, I always knew you were the most competent person in any room. I just didn't say it enough." I drove home with the windows down. It was a warm April night in Nashville. The kind of night that smells like cut grass and rain that hasn't arrived yet. I thought about 37 years of work. I thought about every inspection I'd passed because the work was right, not just right enough. I thought about a classroom of apprentices 20 years ago, young men and women who needed to understand that the pipe in the wall is the promise you make to a stranger, and that stranger trusts you completely without ever knowing your name. I thought about Brandon calling it routine. Here is what I know about building things. The material you use at the foundation determines everything that follows. You can paint the outside any color you want. You can put the finest fixtures on the walls. But the work behind the drywall, the work nobody sees, that is the actual structure. That is the part that holds. Some people never learn the difference between the appearance of integrity and integrity itself. In my experience, they learn it eventually. They just don't always choose when.